Hello, everyone. I'm Martin Doblmeier. It was 248 years ago, a select group of men gathered in Philadelphia, and after contentious debates and at enormous personal risk to themselves and their families, boldly signed their names to what would become the guiding creed for a new nation, the Declaration of Independence. The principal author of that declaration, words that lit a fire not only in those 13 original colonies, but around the world, was a 33-year-old Virginian, a son of the Enlightenment, Thomas Jefferson. In the mid-1990s, I had the opportunity to make a documentary film, a feature documentary film on Jefferson for public television. I loved making that film. I've always been captivated by Jefferson, and not just because we're both Virginians and both, curiously, share the same birth date, April 13th, but because Jefferson's words have proven themselves to be timeless, his ideas endlessly engaging, and his legacy around race and slavery deeply disturbing. I'm joined today by one of our most prolific and acclaimed American historians, Thomas Kidd. Tommy, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to see you again, Tommy. Thomas Kidd is known to many of us in the Journey Films audience for our latest film on Sabbath, where you did such a wonderful job talking about Sabbath practices in early America and then throughout the nation. But I thought you would be the perfect person to join us today because of your most recent book, Thomas Jefferson, A Biography of Spirit and Flesh. Early on in the book, Thomas, you talk about Thomas Jefferson was arguably the most brilliant and inspiring political writer in American history. But you also say that as the founding fathers go, Jefferson was our greatest enigma, the greatest source of controversy. Help us unpack a little bit of what you mean by that.
Well, I think that a lot of Americans are familiar with the enigma of Jefferson and slavery. That's probably what he's best known for, having a conflicted legacy because he's the one who said all men are created equal, and yet he's a slave owner and as a politician certainly doesn't do very much about restricting slavery. But I also was interested in his enigmatic qualities about his moral and religious life. Some of that connects to slavery, about not only the mere fact of being a slave owner, but also, among other things, carrying on a long-term sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves. But how did that fit? I wondered about his moral and religious views, which were certainly in an ethical sense Christian. But he went through a lot of different phases in his life, and really doesn't come to any kind of religious settlement himself until pretty late in life, actually during his first term as president. But many people will have heard of the Jefferson Bible that he produces. It's not the whole Bible; it's an edition of the Gospels alone, in which he cuts out much of the miraculous content. So we know he's a skeptic, but why is he doing a project like that? While he's president of the United States in his free time, he's producing this edition of the Gospels. I think it signals a fascination that borders at times on obsession with understanding what he believes about religion, but particularly about Jesus. It's an enduring fascination of his that continues right on through, the last years of his life.
We can talk about the religious dimension to it, but you also describe your book as a narrative of Jefferson's moral universe. And that's a slightly different understanding. Tell us a little bit about what you mean by that.
Sure. Well, I mean, his moral and ethical code derive in many ways, most ways from Christianity or the Judeo-Christian tradition. But one of the questions I was trying to answer is, well, if we're so troubled today, rightly, about the way that he lived, particularly with regard to slavery, then what was his moral and ethical code, and how did it relate to his religious beliefs? And another issue or related issue to slavery that I learned the most about in the book is that it turns out that Jefferson is insistent on the priority of personal frugality and financial discipline, but he's an absolute disaster in his personal financial life. And we think he dies with about $2.6 million in personal debt in today's money. He's just entirely undisciplined. And yet when you go to social media today, you'll often see these quotes about how you should never spend more than you have from Jefferson. And I think that's probably the most blatant area where he just simply did not live the way that he said other people should live.
Would you not, though, admit, despite the hypocrisy in the way that he lived, the words are timeless, and those have been what we've held on to. The Declaration itself, which he is the leading author of, has been called sort of America's scripture. Now, that's other language, that's not your original language. But talk a little bit about, from that kind of analysis, what kind of ideas Jefferson was trying to embed in that declaration. It was not simply going to be a listing, a categorization of the grievances that the colonies had against King George, although there's some of that in there. But what we all want to remember is this sort of higher moral calling. What was he trying to get to with that language?
Right. Well, and I do think this is why his inconsistencies are so conspicuous, is specifically because of the Declaration and its glorious, soaring language about human equality. And so I think what he's doing there is he realizes the time has come for a final break with Britain in 1776. And so a lot of even arguments that he's made in the previous years about American political rights have depended on Americans' rights as British people, British colonists. And so he knows the time is over for those kind of discussions, and he wants to put the argument for human equality on the broadest and deepest basis possible. And it turns out that he finds that basis in theological language. All men are created equal, and they're endowed by their creator. And so, God shows up in the Declaration as the creator and the one who gave people their most fundamental rights. And so that language, which is rightly so inspiring, so inspired. It's obviously, we think about this at the 4th of July time of year, that this is it's the most important argument that's ever been made for equal human rights. That's it. And yet then you look at this man's own personal life. In some ways, he causes his own problems because he's such a brilliant political writer and definitive, argument for equal human rights, and then it puts the microscope on him about the ways that he did or did not live up to those ideals.
Mm-hmm. It's very inconsistent for all of us, as even looking 250 years later as what was going on. One of the things I want to ask about with you, Tommy, is this whole notion of the religious disposition of the people who were there at the tables signing that Declaration of Independence. And I want to sort of, there's a lot of assumptions that are made about the people's beliefs at that time and their intentionality about all this. Talk a little bit about what was the intention in terms of religion as far as the founders were as they sat around that table creating that declaration?
Well, in the Declaration, I think you can see that there is a lot of religious language in the Declaration. It's not specifically Christian. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. It's more generically theological, talking about God as creator, which is a belief that all the monotheistic religions would share. But it is powerfully religious. I mean, it's not kind of lukewarm, just generic references. I mean, the Virginia Declaration of Rights had said all men are by nature equal, which I think is a much more generic, sort of vague way of putting the point. But for Jefferson and his committee to say, all men are created equal, it's clearly a decision to be more theologically specific. But you can get confused because of that religious language, and obviously in other founding documents, that, oh, well, these people must be devout Christians. And Jefferson certainly is not that, especially not until the early 1800s. Jefferson is a deist, a skeptic, rationalist, has serious doubts about the reliability of the Bible, denies the doctrine of the Trinity, denies the divinity of Christ, denies the resurrection of Christ. I mean, you can just go down the list of sort of the signature basic Christian doctrines historically, and he pretty much denies them all. But he also lives in a mental world in which he assumes that the world was created by God. I mean, this is sort of a pre-Darwinian universe he lives in. And if you said to him, well, did God create the world? I think he would say, well, like, what's the other option? That we live in a created world. And so you have to sort of, with people like Jefferson, and I think some of the other founders fit into this model as well, although the founders are pretty broad range. I mean, there are conservative Christians who are involved with the founding, and then you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum with people like Jefferson. But they do live in a different world where things like created order are just taken for granted in ways that they're not, at least in elite intellectual circles today.
A lot of people look at the Declaration signing, look at those men who came together around that time period with an intention to create a Christian nation. And fundamentally, that's not what you see.
When you look at the Declaration of the Constitution, there are definitely Christian or Judeo-Christian ideas that are there, such as a created universe, such as the inherent dignity of all people. But and I mean, you could go down the list, especially if you get into the Constitution. I think that there are ideas there about the human nature not being, inherently good. So you have to be constantly monitoring people, keeping them from doing bad things. But you have to think about what would it mean for us to be a Christian nation. I mean, one would be that you would expect the founding documents, most obviously the Declaration and the Constitution, to use specifically Christian language, and they don't. And then the First Amendment in particular, prohibits Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion. And at that time, what that means is, are we going to have an official national Christian denomination or not? And I mean, they don't have to imagine what this would be. They're talking about, are we going to have an institution like the Church of England, which is still the official church in England today, and receives, special legal protections and tax support and that sort of thing. And they're okay with states doing that if they want to. And some of the states, especially in New England, continue to have official Christian denominations after the First Amendment. But as far as the nation goes, they say we're not going to have an official national denomination. And so in a legal sense, that is definitely a decision against being a Christian nation.
I mean, it's almost as if they couldn't prefigure it, but at the same time, they did, within what the construct of what they gave us, allow us to create a world that is as religiously diverse. This country is so religiously different than it was at the time of the founding of this country. And yet the documents that now survive 250 or so years later still seem to work, even though the nature of the country in terms of religion has changed vastly. They still work for us, don't they?
They do. And I think it has to do with the genius of not being anti-religion, but emphasizing free exercise of religion, and the government being basically neutral and staying out of the business of religion. I think that is a brilliant solution to what could easily be a major problem of American religious diversity. Now, obviously, we have plenty of cultural conflict about religion. But I think the reason why the model basically works in a legal sense, in a political sense, is that it accommodates religious diversity. It accommodates religious intensity of commitment. But as it has come to pass, it also accommodates secularism. and fundamentally divergent religions, Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, and those religions that have become so much more prominent in America since the 1960s. The free exercise of religion, I think, and a refusal for the government to get involved in picking favorites is what has made that settlement work so well.
Jefferson wrote, he's the principal author of the Declaration, but he wasn't alone on that committee. And one of his companions on the journey was John Adams. Very different characters, the two of them, Jefferson and Adams, as we know. Towards the end of their life, despite the fact that they had become political adversaries, they write these endearing letters back and forth to each other. It's really a remarkable piece of American literature that goes on between Adams and Jefferson at the end. And a lot of the language that in those letters really was around the sort of the casting of the memory of what happened that time period of around the signing of the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. And then, remarkably, as you know, that two of them, Adams and Jefferson, die on exactly the same day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day. How did Jefferson want to have his time and involvement in that declaration be remembered?
Yeah, you're right that correspondence between Adams and Jefferson and their retirement is extraordinary, and it's well worth. I mean, there's a edited volume that contains all those letters that you can buy. That it's well worth reading. It is amazing how often religion and theology come up in their discussions. I mean, one of their favorite topics is just the nature of God. Neither one of them believe in the Trinity. And so they spend a lot of time talking about how dumb they think the Trinity is, and it's made up and not in the Bible and those sorts of things. For me, as a Trinitarian Christian, I sort of wince at some of it, but that's what they want to talk about, and so it's really quite extraordinary. But I think Jefferson, he does think a lot about his legacy. Adams is not so keen on July 4th being the national. He would have liked July 2nd to be the National Independence Day when the Continental Congress actually voted for independence, not the day that they approved the Declaration. But Jefferson thought a lot about his legacy, and you can see it in his instructions, even for what should go on his epitaph, on his tombstone, that he says the Declaration of Independence he wants to be remembered for, and founding the University of Virginia, and then the author of the bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia. That's what he wants to be known for. He leaves off President of the United States, although I think he could assume that people would remember that. But it's quite extraordinary that he's thinking in terms of that statement of human equality. He wants to be remembered for that, for education, and then for religious freedom. I think that tells you a lot ideologically about what Jefferson really prioritized. And even though he is, problematic in many ways personally, those ideas are, I think, are just wonderful contributions that Jefferson made to the American tradition.
Yeah, actually fundamentally changed the world too, I think, in many ways. Thomas Kidd, your book is Thomas Jefferson, A Biography of Spirit and Flesh. Highly recommended. Thank you for this is a wonderful July 4th holiday experience for all of us. And I'm just delighted we had a chance to reconnect. Thank you again for what you did for the Sabbath film for us. So it's great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.